Welcome. My name is Deborah Jacobs. I'm the Executive Director for the Ernest Becker Foundation. I want to thank you for being here. We had 150 people signed up for the webinar, and I especially want to thank the many of you who made donations to support today's webinar and all the work of the EBF. The Ernest Becker Foundation was founded in 1993 to continue the work and application of Ernest Becker. Specifically, we examine the ways in which the human awareness of our own mortality affects our beliefs and our behaviors on both an individual level and a societal level. We believe that understanding the function of death anxiety in ourselves and our society can provide tools to help us live more easily together as people. Over the years, the EBF has sponsored events, supported research, hosted speakers, and developed content related to Becker's synthesis and related science. Our quarterly newsletters examine various social issues in light of relationships to mortality. We're also a hub for interested people who come across the work of Becker and want to learn more and talk with others who have similar interests. And finally, if you find this webinar valuable, please support the EBF by signing up for our newsletters, telling your friends about us, and making a donation. Now, just a little bit about Ernest Becker and terror management theory. I know we have a lot of people on today who are familiar with Becker and TMT, as we call it, but we also have new people. So I want to give a very quick grounding in Becker and terror management theory for those who are first encountering these ideas. Please also know that it takes time to digest these ideas, and there are lots of resources and people available to learn more on the EBF website if you want to take a look. Becker became well known after posthumously winning a Pulitzer Prize in 1974 for his book, The Denial of Death. His key thesis is that culture shields us from death anxiety by enabling us to feel that we are part of something important and valuable that will live on after we're gone. In other words, humans create culture to help us ease our death anxiety. And this is not to imply that it's the only function of culture, but it's a very important one. In the mid-1980s, three social psychologists, Jeff Greenberg, Tom Kaczynski, and Sheldon Solomon, who's one of our speakers today, developed terror management theory to test Becker's synthesis. And this has now grown as a huge field of psychology, and there have been over 1,500 studies demonstrating terror management theory. These theories show that when we are reminded of our mortality, we will seek to affirm our cultural worldviews. We will like those who are like ourselves, and we will seek to marginalize people who we perceive as different from ourselves. And so we're very fortunate today to have two amazing speakers and a host to talk about the application of these issues to the war in Ukraine. I'm going to turn it over for the time being to Michael Mcpherson. Michael is the executive director for the South Seattle Emerald, which is an independent newspaper in Seattle. He's also a combat veteran, retired captain in the US military. He's also my husband. So welcome, Michael.
Hello, everybody. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this webinar about death anxiety and the Russia/Ukraine war. And we really have two awesome guests. Most of you already know Sheldon Solomon. You might not know Cory Dakota Satter. If you don't, for sure, you need to go to his Medium page and read the article that we're going to reference here today. And I don't really like to talk a lot and introduce people. So when our panelists speak, I'm gonna let them tell a little bit about themselves instead of me going into this long drawn out introduction. Now I'm really excited to take part in this panel and to moderate it because as some of you might know, I'm the former executive director of Veterans for Peace. And of course, with the war raging in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, this is something that is a great concern to me. And I do think that death anxiety and terror management theory goes a long way in helping us determine how to end the scourge of war for humanity. So why don't we just go ahead and get started, because you didn't come here to hear me talk. You want to hear from the two panelists. So as I said, Cory, this first question is going to be for you, but before you answer it, if you could just tell people a little bit about yourself. So Cory, I guess one of the reasons we're really doing this is because you wrote this great article called A Terror Management Theory Approach to Understanding Putin's Mind. So what inspired you to take a terror management theory approach to understanding Putin and the war with Ukraine? And can you discuss why you feel that TMT and international relations go hand in hand?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. And so a little bit about me real quick is I have a Bachelor's of Science in Political Science and a Master's in International Cooperation on Human Rights. I have always been fascinated by power dynamics and the underlying motivations for what it is that causes us to seek out power in our species. So there's obviously a huge psychological factor there, which I think will fit well and with this discussion today. So my decision to take a TMT approach to understanding this war and Putin's motivations on a psychological level, like I said, is definitely related to my general interest in politics and international relations. They both concern the distribution of power in society or among states. And it was about a decade ago when I had my first existential crisis. I was sitting under a tree in high school, ruminating on the Arab Spring and some of these autocrats' brutal reactions to it. I wondered what would make someone want to torture another human being or arrest them for something as simple as drawing a cartoon that displeased the president. And jumping ahead a bit, I came to the conclusion that we were an insecure species terrified to die. A lot of people say that we're good or that we're bad, but I think we're scared. And we have different ways to cope with that. One is power or worldviews that make us feel powerful, since it may make us feel less insecure. And there is quite a bit of research to back that hypothesis, some of which was conducted by Sheldon himself and his colleagues in terms of mortality salient increase in consumers' behavior or wealth seeking. And anyway, since that event, I think both life experiences and my studies have more or less led me to become more anchored in that view. So it was only natural for me to apply it to the war in Ukraine. And moreover, maybe more importantly, there's a question of scale here. The war in Ukraine has obviously obvious global ramifications, some of which are really quite terrifying. One is the nuclear aspect, which is pretty self-explanatory, so I won't go down that road. And another relates to food security or insecurity, since Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of grain and wheat and other items. There's a very real risk of a global food crisis, which in some cases has already begun. Here in Tunisia, where I am right now, for example, the supermarkets are empty of flour, which is a staple product for many poor Tunisians who have already suffered a lot over the past decade. Simple rise in bread prices may cause massive suffering and political disruption and violence. And that same situation is replicating itself all over lower income countries right now and merging with other existential crises such as climate change. So in short, I think there is a sort of death anxiety domino effect, if you will. How that war unfolds there will increase the economic security for millions or even billions of people, which will make it difficult for them to make ends meet or fulfill basic needs, resulting in death anxiety and quite possibly upheaval. In fact, existential insecurity and violence are often intertwined. And lastly, as it applies to IR, international relations theory, I think TMT is useful because IR is, or at least historically has been, very state-centric. And while it has made some progress, especially with the appearance of some more critical theories, a lot remains to be made. A lot of progress remains to be made. But in the end, states are made up of humans, and humans are acting according to their own interest or what they think is their interest. And since survival is our strongest instinct, I think it only makes sense that we should focus our attention on the survival instincts of that person or persons that lead that state, and how they cope with their own existential insecurity, especially when that person is the regime. So I think dignity and humiliation studies would go hand in hand with this as well. And TMT's focus on cultural aspects are quite useful, since we may identify certain trends in society that are different from our own, and how one culture might view the best response to a perceived slight or challenge to its influence.
Okay, great, thank you, thank you. Now this question is for both of you, but we're going to start with Sheldon. So can you discuss the different components that make up the mortality salience of being at war? What might soldiers experience, civilians, etc.? And on top of everything else, how a worldwide pandemic may have exacerbated some of those terror management effects. And for the people who don't know you, Sheldon, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'll be happy to, and thank everybody for being here. And Cory, good to meet you. And Michael, thanks for doing this.
Sure.
My connection has been zooming in and out, so I've been missing snippets of conversation. So forgive me in advance if I'm being repetitive or inane in light of Cory's comments
Sure.
already.
Sure.
We, Tom and Jeff and I, designed terror management theory in the last millennium, 40 or so years ago, when we bumped into Ernest Becker's work, and were immediately captivated by his account for why it is that people have such a hard time getting along with other folks who don't share their beliefs about reality. And as you know, or as Cory has already said, or as Deborah has intimated, Becker is profoundly, in some ways, starkly simple and straightforward. We are, on the one hand, like all animals, predisposed to want to survive, and yet, by virtue of our immense intelligence, are aware of the ultimate futility of that basic biological imperative. It gives rise to potentially paralyzing existential anxiety that we manage by embracing cultural worldviews that give us a sense that life has meaning and we have value, and that we're hence eligible for immortality, be it literal or symbolic. And according to Becker and terror management theory, whether we're aware of it or not, mostly we're not. Our primary motivation at all times is to maintain a sense of the soundness of our culturally constructed beliefs and our value as individuals. And I did hear Cory talk about the need for dignity and honor and humiliation, and that, or rather to not be humiliated. And that's the second point, terror management wise. And that is that when existential anxieties are aroused, we will automatically engage in a host of compensatory reactions to restore faith in our beliefs and in our value as individuals. Well, back to your question, Michael, which is, all right, what about the soldiers and what about the citizens involved in warfare? And what Becker and terror management theory would say in general is that there's ample evidence that when death is on our minds, it brings out some of our most unsavory characteristics with regard to our attitudes and behavior towards people who are different. Becker's point is that the mere existence of people that are different is problematic, because if we accept somebody else's beliefs, then we're undermining our own. And consequently, we tend to, denigrate and dehumanize and ultimately destroy, if need be, people that we perceive as the other. I'm making air quotes here, but it's more than that, because our culturally constructed belief systems can't completely eradicate death anxiety. That creates what we call residual terror. Becker called it a panic grumbling beneath the surface of consciousness. And so he always said that we need some place to project our residual death anxiety, and that what we tend to do is to identify someone or some group that we declare the all-encompassing repositories of evil that we must now eradicate. All right, well, finally, back to your point, in times of war, when death is in the air, we should and are seeing, both on the part of soldiers as well on the part of citizens, increases in negative attitudes towards outgroup, increases in hostility towards those who are different. I would also submit that we're seeing increases in mindless submission to powerful autocratic leaders, that this is also part and parcel to what happens when death is on our mind. And I'll slide over to Cory in a moment to give us more substantive details, because his background in history is much more solid than mine. But COVID is, in our lifetimes, been the biggest mortality salience induction in the history of Earth. It has been a pervasive and persistent reminder of death, both consciously and not. And I would submit that this has magnified both the hostilities associated with war, xenophobic tendencies. It has also amplified people's adherence to leaders like Putin, who have declared themselves the only ones capable of saving the Russian Empire.
Right, right. Cory?
Yeah, thank you, Sheldon. I think that's really, I think a lot of people forget how such simple things as like self-esteem and dignity can be overlooked, and how much power they really have over us. I wrote in my article that without self-esteem, given kind of the history of the world, which hasn't always been that great for probably people outside of pre-modern Western society in many cases, maybe we would have just committed collective suicide as a species. Because I mean, up until, for many years, people only lived to around 30 years old. If you already made it to 15, there was like a 60% chance in the Neolithic era that you would die before that. So we needed something to keep us going. And that's where dignity and self-esteem comes in. And we, like Sheldon said, we find meaning in those cultural views that literally tell us why life is worth living. And when that's threatened, we do double down on our worst instincts. And we've seen it a number of times throughout history. A major example could be probably Nazi Germany, when the German nation felt collectively humiliated and its self-esteem injured. We know what happened then, the Rwandan genocide. And then there's more recent examples too, such as 9/11. And I know Sheldon, I think, has actually done some research on this. After 9/11, the mortality salience among Americans really skyrocketed. And there was that rally around the flag effect that led to the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and less than conventional drone warfare around the world as well. So understanding how self-esteem and dignity fits into all this is extremely important, because it is part and parcel to our survival and our identity.
And you're using the term mortality salience quite a bit. So I just want to make sure everybody knows what that is. And I'm not sure if Deborah explained it beforehand, but if there's some people who've only delved into this most recently, they might not even remember if we've explained it. So maybe Sheldon, could you explain what that is for real quickly, so that people know?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. It's a piece of psychobabble that maybe we should avoid using, because it is technically what we use to describe in our experiments when we remind people that they're going to die. But in some ways, it's a bit misleading, because we do, so sometimes we ask people to just jot down their thoughts and feelings about dying. Sometimes we stop them in front of a funeral home as opposed to 100 meters on either side. Sometimes we have them read things on the computer, and we flash the word death so fast, 48 or 28 milliseconds, that you can't even see it. And so technically, mortality salience just refers to any time that death is on your mind, whether you're aware of it or not. We make another distinction between conscious or explicit awareness of death and when you're not conscious of it. And sometimes death is on your mind. Other times it might be, and you're not aware of that fact. This would be a story for another time, but what we know from our research is that conscious and unconscious death thoughts produce qualitatively different reactions. But for our purposes, let's just glob all of those phenomena together for the moment and just talk about, when we talk about mortality salience, we can just say, how about anything either in the lab or in life that raises existential anxieties about life or death.
Right, right. And I just can kind of think of it as just death anxiety.
Yeah.
And it could be you're really thinking about it or you're not, but it's still there.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And maybe for our conversation, that's a more comfortable and familiar term.
Yeah. So next question is, what is Putin's implicit and at times explicit immortality project? And I'm going to direct this towards Cory since he wrote the article.
And a great article.
Yes, very much so.
Thank you, guys. So I think, go ahead.
No, I just said, yeah.
Oh, okay. So I think Putin's immortality project just rests on his own existential insecurity, and as I think he sees things such as control, power, and prestige as counterweights to that. So I think he's found that sort of security, that psychological security, in the idea of a great Russian nation, and which, again, great to him is translated as power, domination, and control. He was clearly affected by the collapse of the Soviet Union, which many commentators have been apt to point out, and that he has lamented on various occasions. So I think he's always probably been a hyper-nationalist, and he's witnessing or has witnessed the downgrade of status of Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which probably for someone who finds comfort and security in the idea of a great Russian nation would have elicited some existential angst. And on top of that, he blames, I think, the West a lot for what has occurred. I do think there's a little bit of justification for that, especially like the privatization wave in Russia that occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which just wreaked havoc on the Russian economy. And so that led to a great amount of resentment. And his project has been to kind of restore what he sees as Russia's rightful place amongst the world. And so far he's largely failed. I think that, but he's trying to leave his mark on history. He's trying to transcend the finite. He's trying, by making Russia great, in his opinion, probably, or psychologically, deep down even, he is leaving something, a lasting legacy that means that he would, in a symbolic way, transcend his own death. And I think that's what he's trying to do here in Ukraine, particularly because of the importance culturally, linguistically, historically, geographically to Russia. So while he's looked around him and he's seen the expansion of NATO, the bombing of Serbia, the invasion of Iraq, the death of Gaddafi, which has supposedly had a major effect on his psyche as well. And now all of a sudden he sees Ukraine following into the Western orbit, whether it was going to join NATO or not, or the EU or not, it was still getting closer. And I think that really was too much for him to handle in many ways for an insecure autocrat. And he launched this invasion. But I think it's all about, at the end of the day, preserving his power so that he can, in a way, transcend his own powerlessness over death.
Right, right. Sheldon, did you have anything briefly you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just real briefly, I think that's a great account. I think it's generally true of many toxic leaders who I would describe as malignantly narcissistic sociopaths with delusions of grandeur and persecution. And what we need to stipulate is that underlying all of those affectations is massive death anxiety, insecurity, that is as a result of feeling the risk of being humiliated, and that this is Putin in a nutshell. Now, let's be clear, this is not to claim that death anxiety is a singular explanation for anything. However, I would submit that, and my guess is Cory might agree here, I don't think that a lot of very intelligent political commentators and political scientists are sufficiently cognizant of how much an incapacity to be wrong or to lose or to be humiliated could drive behaviors that might reduce the earth to a smoldering heap. Anyway, one more thing, and that's that Putin is yearning for symbolic immortality, as Cory mentions. He's also yearning not to die. All right, so there's a long tradition in Russia. During Lenin's time, the Russians started what's called the Immortality Commission. And there's a book by a great UK philosopher, John Gray, where he writes about this. The reason why Lenin's in a glass tomb in the Kremlin is that they've been working for over a century at figuring out how to resuscitate people. And they're quite confident that this will happen at some point. My understanding is that they're getting a glass tomb ready for Putin. So here's this puny man in stature and in character, getting older, getting feeble, getting finite, yearning for his legacy as well as extending his life in perpetuity. He's a caricature of a stereotype of death denial. Wow.
All right. Well, I'm kind of a short guy too. I'm 5'7". So when you said this puny man, it's like
me too. I'm a little guy.
But that reminds me of the pharaohs, though, when you're talking about the tombs and the mummies. You know, so this is something that's been going on for a long time, and I don't know if there's many.
That reminds me of Bezos.
Say that again.
Bezos too has done some research into how he can bring himself back.
Right, right. So this is something that's not one culture. You know, it's across cultures, and I also want to briefly, if you all could briefly speak about this. The Immortality project that you're talking about Putin has when it comes to Russia, but is that any different from even our own presidents when they talk about American exceptionalism or protecting American interest? You know, what do you really, is there a real difference? It might be a difference in how it plays itself out, right? But is there a real difference in the project?
Sheldon, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. There's no real difference in the project. And over to you, Cory. Yeah, there's no real difference. I think what is important to note here is, as you mentioned, Michael, these are universal human affectations that appear routinely over time and space. And while they may manifest themselves differentially, I think it's ultimately the same, and our leaders are no less prone to behaving in this fashion from time to time.
I agree with that. I don't think there's any substantial difference between it. In fact, if you look at our own history, in some ways, for as much as American history and Russian history are different, there was an eastward expansion of Russia. There was a westward expansion of the United States, the Manifest Destiny, saying that we had the right to this land, which was catastrophic for the indigenous inhabitants of it. And from the get-go, we have had this belief that we were an exceptional nation. We had an inflated sense of self. So no, I don't think there's any difference. And every time a president mentions that in a speech and plays to the base, I think he's just kind of doing the same thing that a dictator in another country is doing.
Thank you. We're going to switch in a moment to some questions from the audience. But I want to ask you this, Cory. In your article, you talk about the relationship between death anxiety and the idea of machismo or toxic masculinity regarding Putin and just in general. Can you share some of your thoughts with us on that?
Yeah. And I'll be honest, masculinity studies is something I've only recently got interested in. And so I'm still working my own thoughts out on that. What I can say is that conceptions of manhood and masculinity are, for the most part, socially constructed, even though there's some biological and evolutionary basis for that. One of my favorite photojournalists, Pete Mueller, though, has gotten, I think that's how you pronounce his name, has gone around the world asking men a very simple question: what's it mean to be a man? And you get all sorts of responses, but oftentimes there is a response as well about there's some sort of provider role that it makes a man a man. And that's obvious for evolutionary reasons, because, you know, with being able to provide, it is associated with power as well. If you have power, you can provide resources and you can survive, and your genes get passed down. So I think that kind of intertwined with masculinity. And traditionally speaking, I think traditional masculinity puts an emphasis on power and domination. And I think Putin, as a typical Russian conservative, still holds to that worldview of, you know, he's said it in various speeches and things that he upholds those traditional gender roles, where the men dominate the public sphere, the political sphere. And I think with that idea of masculinity too, he probably takes masculine worldviews. They respond to slights, often forcefully. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what happened when he sees, it's not the only factor, of course, but I think it's a part of it, that he sees that Russia feels humiliated. He sees that the West has wronged him, especially, again, I mentioned Libya, because he did feel that he was lied to in that case. He supported the UN Security Council resolution that bombed Libya on the condition that it would not be a cover for regime change, which, as we all know, it ended up being a cover for regime change. Muammar Gaddafi was sodomized with a bayonet and killed, which freaked him out. So I think that was also, and that supposedly led to him severing what little cooperation there was with the West. So I think that slight, as he would perceive it too, it slowly worked up a more forceful response on his part, because that machismo kind of warrants a powerful response. Saving face is defended with power in traditional patriarchies.
Right. Sheldon, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I just second what Cory said. So let's let the folks that have been listening weigh in.
Yeah, and I actually think we can see that in our everyday lives, just how men interact with each other, you know. So, okay, so one question I have here is, have any one of you or any one of us met Ernest Becker?
No, Ernest Becker died, I believe, in 1973. And Jeff and Tom and I became familiar with his work in 1980 or 1981. We have had the great pleasure and privilege of meeting and exchanging ideas with Marie Becker, and have profited immensely from those interactions.
I just wanted to throw in that for those who don't know, Ernest died shortly before the announcement of his Pulitzer Prize. He was only 49 and he died of colon cancer. And he was at Simon Fraser in Vancouver at the time. There's a bio of Becker on our website if anyone's interested. Sorry for jumping in.
Thank you.
I obviously wasn't alive yet, so I have not met him.
Well, how did you become familiar with his work? Maybe you mentioned that already, but.
Yeah, just briefly, I can say, I mean, back when I was thinking on human motivations that would want to exert power and control over other humans, especially in terms of torture and genocide, those have, in a weird way, always fascinated me. So you can tell I was a fun kid in high school.
Yeah.
And so I think during some research on humiliation and torture and these kind of concepts, I stumbled across terror management theory, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is right down, the train of thought I was kind of thinking of.
Okay. All right. Next question is specifically to Sheldon. You presume that people accept leaders like Putin willingly, and this is certainly not the case. Terror in such regimes stops resistance, and this happens throughout history. So there's a little bit of a comment. What do you have any response to that?
Again, not being a historian and not having been in Russia, I'm not in a position to have an intelligent response. My understanding is that he enjoys 80% of the popular support rural and less educated Russians. I can say, if we wanted to broaden the scope of the conversation, that people in Brazil, people in the United States, people in Australia have voted for authoritarian leaders without any evidence of obvious coercion. And so, respectfully, I can see how some people are supporting Putin out of abject terror. But I would say that in general, the basic dynamic of kind of charismatic popular leaders, as Eric Fromm put it, becoming fused with their masochistic adherents in mutual pursuit of reducing death anxiety. No, I would argue that that's quite operative right now, as evidenced in part by the folks in Ukraine who have family in Russia or even in the US, saying that they can't fathom the degree of support for and enthusiasm about Putin's projects there. So that would be my response to that. Cory, I don't know if you've got.
Yeah, I had a lag, so I think I gathered what the question was, but can you just repeat it again, just to be sure?
Yeah, they were saying that we presume that people accept leaders like Putin willingly, and this is certainly not the case. It's more of a statement. Terror in such regimes stops resistance, and this has happened throughout history. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on, I guess, how willing people are for leaders like this. And let me just say that there is this idea that, and I believe there's some truth to it, because I think over time, nations have a cultural personality, so to speak. And so there's this idea that the Russian people, and maybe even in China as well, because there's been regimes for so long that have centralized power, that's what works best in that particular cultural situation. How true it is, I don't really know, but I think it kind of gets at this statement or question.
Yeah, so I would agree that nations do have cultural personalities, as you say. I think that's a great way to put it. And I definitely think that that might be a fact, that is probably a factor in Russia as well. But more importantly, there are polls, reliable polls, that show Putin is a popular leader. Last I checked, it was around 65, but that was also several months ago. So, or maybe it was 70. But anyway, it was pretty staggering. But there's not only the cultural personality factor too. In autocratic regimes as well, there's a concentration of media. So that's certainly a factor. And although they might know that it's concentrated, I think that in many ways can affect our ways of thinking. And on top of that, I think there probably is some genuine nostalgia for the days before the collapse of the Soviet Union, especially among some of the older folk in Russia. So to see someone like Putin, who presents himself as a strong man, flex his muscles a bit and make it look as if he's standing up for Russia, that might go over very well, especially when there's a large amount of animosity towards the West already among the cultural fabric in Russia. So I think there's probably a very large amount of legitimacy, genuine legitimacy there for him.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of something with some of the Roman emperors when it came to conquering nations for the glory of Rome, and going back to Rome itself and showing the people what we've done for the glory of Rome. It was one of the ways to stay in power, even though there was a lot of oppression going on at the same time. Yeah,
if I could add real quick, and I don't want to be partisan. Actually, I could criticize probably all 50 of the presidents, right, or less. But there was also, I think there's good examples on both the liberal and conservative side in the U.S. Trump had done horrible things abroad, but maintained a high level of support among his base. And Obama had done some horrible things abroad, particularly in Yemen, and still remains a very influential leader among the liberal side of the spectrum. So I think that applies not only to Russia, but to leaders everywhere. They're able to kind of wash away their sins and maintain the support of the populace, as long as it's seen that they're providing benefits to them.
Well, I think this goes with this question about how are immortality projects of nation different from those of specific leaders, or is there a difference, or how are they intertwined with each other?
I'll let Sheldon handle that one if you'd like.
I'm going to go with the easy way out and say that they're intertwined. Because like Cory said, I do think a lot of what characterizes authoritarian leaders is a nostalgic effort to reclaim a glorious time that usually isn't as it's typically portrayed. Jump in. I don't have much more to say on that.
Deborah,
I would love to jump in if that's okay.
Yeah.
I used to live in Finland. I lived there for a couple of years, in my student years. And I recently asked a friend there how she felt about Finland joining NATO. Finland has defended itself from Russia repeatedly over the centuries. And she said that it's funny because it felt like really part of their national identity almost to be a neutral nation and to stay neutral, and it was in their political best interest. And she said, like, in 1 week's time, everybody changed their minds pretty much and had a much greater favorability towards joining NATO. And there is majority public support, I think, there. So I found that interesting as an example of the intertwining of a national and individual identity and how that can readily shift in certain circumstances of threat.
I would second everything there too. And again, I think that we see some of that in our own beliefs about American influence in the world, I guess is the word that I'll use here. There's a lot of Americans, I think, still believe that America should have the leading role in the world. And in fact, we do say that our congressmen and women and our presidents say it repeatedly every year that we need to lead. So, and Americans like to hear that. So I do, yeah, it is intertwined.
God bless America.
Yeah.
At the beginning, Cory mentioned he wouldn't dive into the topic of nuclear warfare. But I think the threat of a possible nuclear war is inducing a lot of death anxiety. So what do you two think about that?
Yeah, again, to be silly, I do think we're in a kind of perseverating, dialectically escalating death spiral. I mean, I was going to say I'm being silly, but I'm not sure that I am. Maybe this has happened before in history, but this is a remarkable confluence of reminders of our finitude. You know, we've got the pandemic at the same time. We've got wars that are now broadcast, 24/7 live. We've got, the planet is melting. We've got a drift away from democracy towards authoritarianism. And I see this as a really big change of historical consequence. And it just, and all of these things are magnifying each other. And I don't think it's an overstatement to note that a good chunk of the world is in some stage of like PTSD. I really do think it's not an overstatement to describe the average person as kind of a sleepwalking zombie in a dissociated stupor, trying to make the best out of a historically unprecedented moment. Yes, I do think death is on a lot of our minds, whether we know it or not.
Right, right.
I would agree with that too. Yeah, I mean, it was the climate catastrophe was on my mind before all this happened, and then all of a sudden there was a nuclear specter, and that I felt it was psychologically overwhelming. And on top of that, like Sheldon mentioned, it does become a vicious circle, because the more that this death is on people's minds, or that feelings of insecurity are kind of heightened, it's also going to make us around the world double down on our worst instincts. So it becomes a vicious circle. It makes us double down in the West. It makes Russia double down too, and it's going to make finding a way to de-escalate the crisis a lot harder.
Right, right.
Yeah, and if I could put in a plug for a book, I don't want to ruin your day, but this came out like a week ago. It's called Global Burning: Rising Anti-Democracy and the Climate Crisis, by Eve Darian-Smith. She's the head of global studies at UC Irvine. And she makes, unfortunately, a great case for the connection between authoritarian leaders and trashing the planet. And if you read the book, you'd see the role of existential anxieties in all of these things. But she's like, these things are connected. Anyway, that's yeah.
So I want to get to this question, and then we want to get to some questions about how we could maybe make things better using this. So many people have remarked that Western media is so focused on the Russia-Ukraine war, while other wars are raging in different parts of the world. So this makes sense to me for Europeans, because the battle is happening in Europe, and the continent has a long history of war and tension between major powers. I mean, if we had a war happening here in North America, we'd be really paying attention to that too, right? However, the US focus on the war is not so easy to explain. And we've talked about this a little bit already. For the past 20 years, we conducted wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We continue the global war on terror in one fashion or another. Further, while we are not responsible for the Russian attack on Ukraine, we added to the political conditions leading to the war. Yet there is little talk about our wars, the US wars. There's little talk about wars everywhere else, or US policies contributing to Ukraine and the Russian war. And interestingly, I just have to bring up that on Wednesday, former President Bush made this comment, and I'm reading something from ABC News. So there's a little piece of commentary in it, but his comment was, quote, "The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia, and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq," said Bush before catching himself and shaking his head. I mean, of Ukraine. Realizing his mistake, Bush then appeared to say under his breath, "Iraq too." So how can TMT, or death anxiety, help us understand why this different, paying attention to the wars there, but not looking at yourself pretty much at all?
Yeah, if I may start, I think that the main thing is that TMT teaches us that we do not like to have our worldviews challenged. So it makes it extremely difficult, whether someone else is challenging our own worldview, or if we're challenging it ourselves through introspection. We don't like it. I think everyone wants to kind of feel like they're the hero in their own story. That's attached to the whole dignity and self-esteem concept. We want to think we're the good guys. And we've told ourselves here in the US for decades that we are the good guys. We call ourselves the leader of the free world, which doesn't stand up to scrutiny in many parts of the world. Here in Tunisia, just the other day, when I was on the street, someone asked where I was from. I told him I was American. And he went into a tirade about the war in Ukraine. What's that?
I said, ooh.
Oh, and he asked me, well, why is it that America bombs Yemen, or why do they support the Israelis in their occupation of Palestine? And quite frankly, I didn't really have a good response for him, because I couldn't explain to him why Ukraine was more important to us than these countries were, or why it was okay in one situation and not in the other. I mean, in many ways, Putin did take a page right out of George W. Bush's playbook when he manufactured lies about the existence of chemical weapons and arms in Ukraine, and when he invaded a sovereign country without authorization for the UN Security Council. In many ways, it was a copy. So there's a lot of hypocrisy, and I think at the end of the day, it's because we don't like to challenge ourselves. Well, I think we're the good guys.
Thank you. Sheldon?
No, just I second what Cory says. Without appearing to be unilaterally condemning America, but it is the case that we are arrogantly egocentric in our proclamation that we're exceptional, and that therefore, by definition, anything that we do is fine. And I think this would be a good moment for a little bit of humility. Henry Ford famously said, "History is bunk." And we do have a tendency to be blithely ahistorical, and not surprisingly, to view things from our own perspective. And so when you started the question, Michael, and said, "Oh yeah, why are we more concerned about a war in Ukraine and Europe and not so much in Syria?" Yeah, I think it's like, yeah, Ukraine, Europe, those are like almost like us. That is like kind of white. Mm-hmm. And Syria, not. So we don't need to worry about them so much. But part of that is a result of our extraordinarily mangled media environment that lobotomizes the average American to the point where we're not only unaware of what's happening in the world, we're disinclined to find out. I mean, a good start, in my opinion, maybe not surprisingly, as an educator, I'm putting a lot of faith in education. But I've been humbled in the last few years by my own efforts to become more informed, just starting with being sure I look at lots of news sources from around the world to get perspectives beyond those that are presented here. I mean, this is a story for another time, because Putin obviously has his own state propaganda apparatus, and we on this end have our own unholy alliance between the media, particularly Rupert Murdoch and Fox News, and almost everything bad that's happening in the Western world. And I think that's contributed to our incapacity to see things more clearly.
Right.
If I could add really quick too, I mean, I remember seeing a tweet put out by Michael McFaul, who was our ambassador to Russia and became and is a professor at Stanford. And he was saying that the Russians bear collective responsibility as a people for the crises there. And it was interesting though, because as you mentioned, we do have a more open environment. Yeah, we have a lot of concentrated media and everything too. But if we have freedom, a lot more editorial freedom, and we do have free independent media outlets, and yet Americans support many of our actions abroad, then his argument almost applies even more to us than it would to the Russians, who don't have access to some of these free or more open news sources. So, yeah, I just figured that was worth adding.
Yeah, it is. And I think, again, it speaks to this idea of self-image and how you need to see yourself. And as one of you said, you want to be the hero in your own story. So, but then that makes me feel bad, because does that mean I'm not my hero? I'm not really a hero in my story. Maybe I'm not. So, I'm trying to do what's right. So let's look, because we have like 6 more minutes before it's 11 o'clock, at least here, because it's not in Tunisia. So one question is, what are some great examples of pro-social and life-giving reactions to this current war across the globe? That, I guess, maybe, when you talk about terror management theory and people really kind of doubling down on their view. But we've been talking about the negative. Maybe there's people doubling down on the positive too, and trying to do some positive things based on their reaction to their death anxiety.
I think that's a great point, Michael. One thing that's important to note is that, yeah, according to Becker and terror management theory, existential anxieties magnify pre-existing beliefs and behaviors. And so, for example, I think it was Jeff and his colleagues who did a study showing that when people are reminded of their mortality, it makes them more generous and altruistic, at least towards people that they consider to be members of their tribe. And there's been numerous examples of people being very generous, not only monetarily, but literally folks going over to Europe and Ukraine and Hungary and Poland to be directly involved helping. And so I could see lots of opportunities to I don't want, exploit's a bad word because it has negative connotations. I can see lots of ways to Aikido our basic yearning for meaning and value in ways that might foster constructive outcomes, starting with work that Tom Pazinski has done with his students, where he just shows that if you can convince people that we're more similar than we are different, and that all of us are members of one big family, which sounds corny, but has the benefit of being true, when we're reminded of death, we don't hate people who are different. And so one way that's indirect to use terror management ideas constructively is to go at it indirectly, and that is we've got to remind each other, as Herman Melville did in Moby Dick, that we're all in the same boat and we're going to go down or we're going to stay afloat together, and why that's so existentially important.
Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It can be an uphill battle at sometimes, but there are ways, like Sheldon said, that when people are reminded of it or of their mortality, they end up being more pro-social to members of their own group or tribe. So I think there's also practical applications of that. That how we could take advantage of that, even in just something such as urbanism, like make it planning more public spaces that can bring more people together and cross boundaries. I think is one way to just practical way to put those to kind of develop and hone those pro-social values.
Great. All right. Well, I just want to thank you two for this great discussion. It's greatly appreciated, and I'm sure the audience got quite a bit out of it. And I'm going to hand it back on to Deborah.
And thank you, Michael, for being our moderator. And Cory, this is our first time having you on a EBF program. I hope it will not be the last. You're fantastic. And Sheldon, you're always the crowd favorite, as you know. So I want to encourage people to sign up for the EBF's newsletters. I don't think we'll overwhelm you, but you'll hear about upcoming programs and things we're engaged in. I'm working right now on our next webinar on abortion rights and death anxiety. So that should be a really interesting and relevant one. And I think we're going to try to give some helpful guidance for people trying to influence one another on that issue. And we really appreciate any financial support you can give. We operate on a shoestring and are really run on passion for these issues and the belief that by understanding this phenomena, by understanding how death anxiety impacts us, we can all be better actors in society and live more easily with one another, and that's our goal. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks again to our wonderful panelists.